Good evening, everybody. I hope you can all hear me. I'm Andrew Bamford. I'm the series editor for From Reason to Revolution. I'm going to be hosting tonight's Hellion event. I'll just do. I mean, some of you I know, for recognising the names, have been to lots of these now, and are probably sick to death of me doing the technical spiel. But just very briefly for anybody who's not used this platform before. So Demio that we're using is, as you've discovered by the art of getting here, is entirely a web-based platform. So that's one of its strengths. You don't have to download any software or sign up to anything. The downside, of course, is that it is entirely dependent on your internet connections. If you find you're having any trouble during the course of the event, you may wish to switch a different browser if you've got that. You may also find it helpful, and he says this while remembering to do it himself, to close down other windows that you might have opened in the background so that the signal can concentrate on this. If you do lose us completely at any point in the evening, everybody who's registered for the event will automatically get a video sent to them, and that should arrive in your inbox overnight. One thing I would explain, because we had a bit of confusion over this with the last event we ran, the video that you get sent immediately is automatically generated by Demio, so it's not edited in any way. You'll get the blank 10 minutes at the beginning before I appeared, and you'll get some dead space at the end as we're closing down. We will in due course post a properly edited version on the Hellion YouTube that will remove anything like that and just give you the event that you signed up for. But obviously the automatic bit can't do clever stuff like that. So having done the tech, well, the other tech I'm going to say is, of course, you've all found the chat, and do please post your questions in there for either of our speakers tonight, and we'll do a combined Q&A at the end, and I can read people's questions out for that. But to introduce the event itself, then, this is a slight twist on a format. I know the standard welcome slide said welcome to this book launch. It's not strictly speaking a book launch. The two books have been out for a few months now, but for various reasons, mostly Hellion's fault, actually getting the two authors and myself together on an evening to do this took a bit more planning than we'd anticipated. So it's we're marketing it as a virtual book chat rather than a launch, although we do have a discount in the usual way off the two books, which I've posted in the chat and which I'll post again a couple of times, so you've got the code during the course of the evening. But we thought from the outset we had these two books appearing at the same time, or pretty much on overlapping subjects, looking first of all at the Marathas and the Army of Hindustan from Andy Copestake. And then Josh Provan looking at the Anglo-Maratha War and the campaign against the Jats. So we thought a combined event seemed the obvious thing to do. Obviously, you all thought that was a good idea because there's over 50 of you turned up for it tonight. So I'm pleased that you like the idea. So we'll hear from Andy first of all in a moment, and he'll talk you through some of his research. We'll then hear from Josh, and then, as I say, we'll do a combined Q&A at the end of the session. So if you bear with me a moment while I do technical things, we will bring Andy onto the stage in a moment. We'll pop up some slides. And there we go. And I will on that note disappear and leave you to the two speakers for the evening. Thank you very much, Andy. It's all yours.
Oh, good. Hello. Good evening, everyone. Now, before we begin properly, I'd like to thank Andrew Bamford and Hellion for the chance to do this. I'm looking forward to an interesting evening and some interesting questions, which with a bit of luck, I might even get the answers right. So here we go. Most of you that are here, I suspect, will already have some idea about what the book's about. But that is to say, the Maratha armies of the last quarter of the 18th century. Now, I'm going to read a bit of this and see. And the mercenaries who commanded their formidable regular infantry and artillery arms. These are the armies that would fight the British in the first years of the 19th century in some of the hardest fighting in India that the British had yet seen up to that date. The Maratha armies that would eventually fight the future Duke of Wellington at the battle he always considered to be his hardest fight, Assaye, in 1803, didn't just arise out of smoke and thin air. They didn't come into existence overnight merely as a convenient enemy for the future Duke to begin his rise to fame with by beating. Though this is often the impression you get from some of the more traditional British historians. Indeed, it might be argued that Indian military history, as written by the British, particularly those of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was merely the story of victorious British arms and those victorious British arms and those enemies, either other colonial powers such as France or the so-called country powers, those states already established outside immediate British control, like Hyderabad, or indeed the Maratha Confederacy, were only there to provide more victories for British forces in their preordained rise to domination on the Indian subcontinent. Needless to say, that is utter nonsense. There was plenty of, well, history really, happening on the outside the confines of the various British-controlled territories, which had little or nothing to do with the British themselves. But this has only recently been considered by writers outside India in the last few decades. Researching and writing about these events for English readers to hopefully redress the balance was one of the reasons I finally undertook this project in the first place. But the main reason was simply because such military history, away from the usual track, is so fascinating in its own right. I'd actually been researching the mercenaries since the late 1970s, off and on, and doing other projects, with no real hope of getting a book published until I encountered Hellion. I quite quickly realised in these researches that most of the stuff written in English about Indian armies in the 18th century was at best misleading and often quite wrong. The Marathas especially seem to have received a bad press from some British writers simply because their traditional armies, often consisting of hordes of predatory light cavalry, whose métier was raid and plunder rather than battle, were so difficult for the British to understand, let alone control. Now, they looked like that. That's a contemporary drawing taken in the 1780s of what the British encountered in the First and in the Second Maratha War. There were literally thousands of these cavalry in huge numbers compared to them, but they weren't line of battle cavalry. They were simply raiders, plunderers, but they could make the British Army's life a misery as it tried to move through Maratha territory. But what they couldn't do was hold territory. They could easily be dispersed at any time, as you'll find out if hopefully you read the book. I would actually argue that because of the way the British and other country powers treated the Marathas, there was a minor military revolution in India in the period after the Battle of Panipat, where French largely and then British mercenaries ended up commanding drilled forces that were raised to copy the forces of the British and the French, because the Indian rulers realized that they could no longer fight battles with what were essentially 16th and 17th century armies. To do this, they needed military experts, mercenaries of whom Benoit de Boyne, although by no means the first, was the most successful of the military entrepreneurs who saw active service in the wars of the princely states. And these wars were almost continuous. There was fighting in northern India almost every year between 1761 and 1805. There was not a time when there was peace overall. What I found quite interesting to begin with was that the first of these mercenary forces was not raised by a European at all, but by Ibrahim Khan Gadi, who was a Muslim officer who had served with the French, and he raised a force of 10 battalions and 50 guns based on the French model of the 7 Years' War and the troops he'd seen fighting the British in India. And they were in the service of the Peshwa, the head of the Maratha Confederacy at the time. Unfortunately, despite building a good reputation through the 1750s, they were smashed at the Battle of Panipat and Ibrahim Khan was killed. But the term lingered on. You'll see it in the sources as a term for a trained infantry musketeer. It lasted for at least 20 years in Maratha and other Indian sort of military terminology. All of these mercenary forces were on a very similar model. And that model was usually battalions of regular drilled infantry, which traditional Indian armies simply didn't have, backed up by an artillery that was a lot more mobile than, again, the sort of 16th and 17th century style artillery of Mughal or Rajput armies. All this is in the book, but most of the brigades were of a similar size, anything from 2 to 6. They use the term paltan, which is a corruption of battalion, with 3 to 5 guns per battalion, which was a much higher level of artillery than you would get in a contemporary European army. And they were commanded often by a mercenary. There were, and with each individual battalion usually being commanded by a European, though not always. And the commander was of the mercenary group, the Kompu as it was known, would often be in the earliest days French or German, and then later British. The two early examples would be that of the very first brigade, which was raised in the 1760s by a German deserter from both the British East India Company forces and the French East India Company forces, called Walter Reinhardt, who gained the sobriquet Somru, which apparently means somber or miserable. And his battalion, his forces range from usually about 4 battalions with maybe 30 or 40 guns, and sometimes a regiment of cavalry. He served the imperial court for a long time, and then when he died in the 1770s, the force was taken over by his enterprising wife, the Begum Somru, whom some of you will have heard of, an extremely enterprising lady who managed to keep her troops in play and as an army until she died well after the British conquest of Hindustan. De Boyne was not one of the first of these mercenaries. He came in what you might call the second generation. Once the British had fought the French during the period of the American War of Independence, there were again a lot of spare mercenaries wandering about. De Boyne actually came to India via Egypt and landed in India and was, after service in the French army, although he was Italian, became lost and captured by the Turks. And then, again, this is the sort of thing that will turn up in the book, and ended up in India by a long and tortuous path. And in order to earn his bread, had to join the East India Company's army. Again, politics, the general situation in India ended up with him being more or less trapped and not quite penniless outside Delhi, and he was forced to join or raise a force for Madhaji Scindia, the greatest of arguably the greatest leader that appeared in India in that part of the 18th century, that eventually, after a lot of hard work, became the Army of Hindustan. What was different about de Boyn's troops was that they were trained in the British manner, not the French. And most of the compus up to that date, up to the 1780s, had been trained in the French manner. Also, de Boyn's troops were uniformed in the British manner, as you'll see from this. This slide shows the three main troop types in the regular brigades. The first, who looks very British, is what was known as a Tilinga. In each of his 10 battalion brigades, 7 of the battalions were Tilingas like this, drilled in the British manner. Now, next is what was known as a Nujib or Najib. They were usually Muslim troops, and to begin with, they were armed with matchlocks, but later they got flintlocks made by an arms industry run by a Scotsman called Sangster that was able to supply weapons for the whole of the army of Hindustan. And again, all this will be explained in the book. The third, the cavalry trooper, is one of the small cavalry regiment of regular troops that was attached to each brigade. It might seem odd to have cavalry attached to an infantry brigade, but believe me, it wasn't, because frankly, a lot of the irregular cavalry that were about was simply not reliable to do the kind of duty that was needed. So that explains the appearance of his troops, and that's one of the reasons they were different. The Nujib, the fellow in the middle, a lot of the other compus, especially those led by Indians, and indeed, from what little we know, those of the Begum Somru, would be dressed like in a similar style to that. But other than that, we actually don't know a great deal about them. But what was really important, and the thing that surprised me, was the financial footing that these people needed. They needed vast amounts of money. And that's how it came about that de Boyn ended up administering large areas of Hindustan under Madhaji's seal, if you like, in the name of the emperor. It became strange to see a European administering. And needless to say, he and other mercenaries, the lucky ones, made a fortune, though most of them died in India. Again, all of this will be explained in the book. But without the finances, then there would have been no army of Hindustan, and therefore there would have been no victories. One of the things, again, that fascinated me is when you look at the comparative size of the battles that the British and French had fought in the south of India during Robert Clive's time, was how small they were compared to the comparatively large actions that the army of Hindustan and the Marathas fought against the Rajputs or against the Mughals who resisted Scindia's encroachments, or against the Rohillas, or against anyone else who got in the way, to be honest. Most of these battles had around about 50,000 or more combatants in them, split between the two sides. The normal strength for many of the armies that the Marathas fielded in this period from the 1780s onwards would be around about 30 to 40,000 men, as far as of which vast numbers would be the light cavalry. But the artillery trains were also pretty formidable. Each of de Boyn's battalions, whether Tilinga or Nujib, would have 4 guns and a howitzer attached to it as part of the battalion. Sometimes they didn't bother with the howitzer and they just had 5 guns. Where does all this information come from? Well, there are several books that were written more or less contemporary, of which the most entertaining, though possibly not the most accurate, is James Skinner's memoirs. Originally, he wrote them in Persian, but then his friend and well, not really biographer, his friend and the adjutant of his own cavalry regiment translated them into English, which is what we read now. One of the things I also wanted to do in the book was use as many Indian historians as I can, although obviously I'm limited by not being able to read Persian. It's not a language. It's not a language and a script that I'm familiar with. However, I've lost a page here. Where's it gone? I've dropped one. The mercenaries were of all sorts of nationalities. I mean, there was even an American who served the Peshwa and who served the Nizam of Hyderabad. The great thing about the whole mercenary movement was how diverse it was. And I think there is room for a lot more research, and I'm going to continue, because there needs to be, I think there's another part of the story to tell. There's certainly another part of the story to tell. But it's going to take time. At its strongest, the Army of Hindustan contained 5 brigades, something like 50 infantry battalions, each around about 500 to 700 men strong, and 50 guns per brigade. Now, not all of them took the field at the same time, and the quality did deteriorate slightly after de Boyne retired. But these troops were still good enough, strong enough, despite the political shenanigans of that appeared after the death of Madhaji and the retirement of de Boyne, to give the Duke of Wellington and General Gerard Lake some of the hardest fighting they would ever see. I mean, to paraphrase Wellington from a much later and more famous of his battles, it was a damn close run thing. And I think that's the part of the story where Josh will take over, and he will now continue. I think that's about it for me for the time being. And I hope you've been able to hear that.
Thank you, Andy. I can certainly hear you, so I hope everybody else could. That was brilliant. As you say, we'll make you disappear for the moment, and I'll bring Josh on, and we'll hear the part 2 of the story, and then we'll bring you back for Q&A at the end of the session. I've been watching the chat as we've been going on. I can see quite a lot of comment being made. I mean, do if you want me to post something as a question in there, do please make it clear as to a question mark at the end, so I know it's something you want to read out to the speakers, rather than just an observation as we go along. But I'll bring Josh on now, and switch over the slides. Here we go, and hopefully we'll now get part 2 of the story, and the perspective of Wellesley and Lake, and the challenge of tackling in combat the units that Andy's just described for us. So, Josh, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I don't appear to be sort of visible to the audience at the second, for which I do not quite know. I don't have an answer for why I can't be seen. Yeah, there we go. Let's see. I have a prompt here. Excellent. So maybe that will help. Well, is that any better there, Andrew?
We can hear you absolutely fine, but we don't seem to be able to see you.
Okay. Well, I suppose we should just press on, because I don't quite know how I can rectify it unless you have any ideas.
No, that was my attempt with the prompt to get you to turn the camera on, but it says your camera's already on. So
yes, there must be some sort of...
I'm not clear what's going off there, but we can hear you perfectly well. We've got the slides, so I think we can manage.
Okay, we'll press ahead then. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. But thank you again, Andrew, and hello, everybody. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you're having an excellent morning, afternoon, or evening. And I'm very grateful to you all for joining us. I took the liberty of inflicting my book on the world because of the misconceptions I had encountered online regarding the military history of the long 18th century in India. To my recollection, the germ was sown after a bewildering Twitter argument with an entity who argued that the Confederate commander Thomas J. Jackson, best known for his work with stone walls, had a more impressive record than Wellington. This farcical discussion, the type of which, when taken too seriously, generally devolves into absurdity and is indeed some of the most embarrassing things you can see two grown people engage in, led down a road where the comparative means at the disposal of the two generals was brought up as proof of the Confederate superiority. I forget the actual words, but they were to the effect of Wellington had more money, supplies, and men, and the Indian armies he encountered were pushovers. Later, having strenuously disagreed, and both parties having returned to their respective corners, boasting to themselves of their success, I realized how little I actually knew of the realities of the Battle of Versailles, and indeed soldiering in India. Later, I made the acquaintance of the journalist and author Mani Mugdha Sharma and the historian Amarpal Singh Sidhu, who have become good friends, and whose articles and writings on the military culture of South Asia confirmed to my mind that despite the coverage that warfare in India gets through the prism of Wellington's biographies and popular fiction, there was not enough that examined this period of Indian history. My excuse for covering what some consider to be already trodden ground is that history is very much like fresh water. It needs to circulate and replenish, or it will inevitably drain or evaporate away. When I looked into it, the majority of the standalone works were quite dated, which is no great crime, but it makes them less attractive to casual readers, out of print or overly expensive. To my mind, there were signs that an evaporation was occurring here, and people were becoming satisfied with the story they read once in a Bernard Cornwell novel. So when Andrew Bamford suggested that I consider as a topic the British Army in India, I realized that the Second Maratha War, with its relatively rich pool of first-hand accounts, wide geographical coverage, and famous figures and battles, was the perfect medium through which to survey the challenges of soldiering in India. And so we get this book that you see on the screen in front of you, and some of you may indeed own. The title, Bullocks, Grain and Good Madeira, reflects certain constants that you find in British accounts of the war, but were also universally important to all armies in India. General Wellesley was constantly making sure he had an ample supply of bullocks and grain, while his officers always tried to ensure that they had a good supply of brandy, Shiraz, or Madeira to accompany them if possible. This will give you the hint that I tried to pay as much attention to how a musket cartridge got to the battlefield as to how, where, and when it was fired on it. If you should choose to pick up my scribbling, you will find that care over logistics was at the forefront of everyone's mind, because the time between about 1775 to 1803 is known as the Gurdi Ka Waqt, or the time of troubles, during which there is an almost endless cycle of war across India, but especially, as Andy has just sort of briefly said, especially between the zone between Mysore and Hindustan. The constant tread of armies and the devastation they inevitably incurred brought famine, fire, and sword to vast swathes of the countryside. Wild animals famously were seen to become more and more daring and inhabit roads and the environs of villages, now abandoned by whole populations. British eyewitnesses in the Deccan, which is the sort of broad plateau of central India, where the Maratha Civil War had raged after the deaths of Mahadaji Scindia and the statesman known as the Machiavelli of India, Nana Fadnavis, recorded appalling scenes of suffering in the rural areas, and these bring home the realities of war upon the people trying to get on in life while the political world around them was tearing itself apart. Now, returning to the military side of things, let's get out of the Deccan. Because although being an avowed admirer of Wellington, I was pretty quick to throw away the common practice of focusing only on that campaign at the expense of what then was the more important theatre politically, that being Lord Lake's operations in Hindustan, and to as much as possible give time and acknowledgement to the prowess and skill of the Maratha Regular Corps, that maligned and remarkable force, which my co-speaker tonight has properly called the Army of Hindustan. By far the most enjoyable part of writing this book was the opportunity to present the Marathas as an enemy that, given better circumstances, could have defeated their enemies in one theatre or another. I'll briefly say here that had not the Army of Hindustan's officer corps been in tatters and the state itself been crippled by a punishing series of civil wars that saw its most talented general shunted off as a factional spectator, the battles of Asai and Laswari would likely have been remembered as crushing defeats for the British, and in the case of Asai would likely have seen the capture, death, or ruin of most of the senior British officers involved. Anyone investigating this conflict will find that the British were just not prepared for the toughness of their opposition, in the sense that generally they could not avoid ending up being wrong-footed and taking heavy casualties, and they didn't learn from it either, as we see during the Sikh Wars. The Marathas knew well enough that the British would always attack them if they could, and so attempted to lure them into constricted but exposed killing grounds swept by their artillery. Now, ironically, the Marathas' comfort and reliance on their regulars did actually play into British hands, because by 1803, the Army of Hindustan was in a state of relative disorder, and a rot was setting into its officer corps all the way up to the commander-in-chief, Perron. This meant that, generally, when it came down to volleys and bayonets, the British side tended to come out better. General Wellesley was of the opinion, and he had a lot of opinions by the time he finished India, that had the Marathas fought the British in what he termed their old manner, more or less like Holkar fought Lake, they'd have caused greater damage than in accepting field battles, and indeed Wellesley was so desperate to catch Scindia's evasive army that he blundered into the Battle of Asai whilst pursuing it. As Andy's book title says, the infantry and guns of the Marathas deeply shocked the British, and it demonstrates how much the Marathas were relying on their regulars to win their battles for them, as a result of the activities of Debuan and his successors. Indeed, most contemporaries by 1803 seemed to think that there was nothing that separated a Maratha sepoy from a East India Presidency sepoy in terms of quality, training, or equipment. This is a fact that most European officers freely acknowledged. Indeed, on a few occasions, the Maratha sepoys were even described in terms of higher quality. It was impossible for me, though, to go into the level of detail that Andy has gone into for this book, though I dearly wanted to get into the organization, traditions, and esprit de corps of the Army of Hindustan and its colourful mercenary officers. Much had to be sacrificed, and I remember hoping someone would do justice to the Army of Hindustan someday. So I was delighted when I read Andy's book for the Napoleon series, because it did just that, and would have made writing my book infinitely easier if I'd had it then. I must therefore recommend it to you in the highest possible terms. So back to the Second War then. One British officer wrote that, with the exception of a hard winter's campaign, no one in Europe could conceive the difficulties of a war in India, with the obvious implication, confirmed by Wellington in later life, that if you can wage a successful war in India, you could do it anywhere. The Second Maratha War is exemplary in being able to show a reader the vagaries and variety of challenges this country throws at generals. Wellesley chose the audacious route, which, as luck would have it, was the right course, even if he badly underestimated the enemy and suffered perhaps unnecessary casualties in carrying out his strategy. Lake chose the more solid, but no less aggressive stance, yet certainly again, was guilty of underestimating the Marathas and indeed almost lost much of his gains by ending his campaign both prematurely and without securing an agreement with the most fascinating character of the war, Yashwantrao Holkar. The Maratha War, we should remember, is as much about the fall of the always somewhat precarious Maratha state as it was the expansion of Britain's power in India. By that I mean that although the best accounts and even the descriptions of the Marathas largely come from the British side, this is properly a Maratha tragedy. And at the heart of it are the characters of Bajirao II, Dadatrao Scindia, and Yashwantrao Holkar. Now, no matter what anyone tells you about making movies or novels about Wellesley's Deccan campaign, always remember that it's Yashwantrao Holkar or Begum Sumru. These are the people that you want to make the movie about. James Skinner, or one of the mercenaries working for the Maratha forces, would be equally good choices. People like Colonel Gardner, or like independent nutcases like Thomas, or the Pathan soldier of fortune Amir Khan. Because another major aspect, indeed, of this period in India is how different the social and political elements are from popular imagination. It's really not the pith helmets, tiffin, and the easily divided world of the late Victorian Raj. It's by far a much more fluid and messy place in which a Firangi, a friend, and an enemy could be anyone, or indeed one and the same individual. Something to remember about this conflict is that it contains, in effect, two wars, not counting the smaller campaigns that occurred in the orbit of the larger two. Each were motivated by different sets of political considerations. There was Scindia's war and Holkar's war. Holkar was a continuation of his own initial struggle against the Peshwa and his allies. And Scindia, his was because Bajirao II allied himself to the British after being defeated by Holkar and signing the Treaty of Bassein. Indeed, the early part of the campaign for the British was about restoring Bajirao to his masnud in Poon, thus gaining Governor-General Wellesley a much sought-after presence in the principal Maratha court. But what should just have been a limited operation against Holkar, not unlike other prosecutions of the so-called forward policy, became a full-scale war against the Scindia-Bonsla Confederates. So if you want to see the Maratha War as a Maratha story, then paying attention to Holkar's war gives you that leeway. Not only did he defeat the Scindia-Peshwa alliance and live an impossibly adventurous and dramatic life before that, but he presided over what was called the worst and most humiliating defeat of British arms in India to that date, when he hounded and utterly disintegrated Lake's watchdog army in Rajasthan under Colonel Monson, and came within an ace of recapturing either Delhi or Agra, forcing Lake to return to the field, which led him to the stunning reverse before the monolithic walls of Bharatpur. The inability to forge a workable coalition undid Holkar's successes, but his part in the conflict and Lake's tremendous failure against the Jats, to my mind, are the most fascinating parts of this war, and show that the war didn't end so satisfactorily as people think either. It is necessary reading, I think, as well, for those searching for the examples to challenge the myth of British military invincibility in South Asia. Now, what is this Bharatpur? It's not as famous as Asai. It's quite obscure, really. And this campaign against Holkar? Well, properly it is an extension, as I said, of the war, rather than the war proper. Holkar was the original enemy at the very beginning. But that was because he was also the enemy of Scindia. And for a time, it didn't look like he was going to fight the British. Lake scrambled to resecure Rajasthan after Monson's defeat, is dominated by Holkar's attempt to use his plentiful cavalry to slow Lake down long enough for him to seize Delhi. Now, after saving the city and chasing off Holkar, Lake turned to make an example of Ranjit Singh of Bharatpur. Now, this isn't the Ranjit Singh of Punjab, the line of Punjab. This is a different guy. He was the leader of the Jats. And he had broken faith with the British when Holkar was winning, and Lake took this as a personal insult. The British managed to take the frontier fortress of Deeg, but due to one of the most energetic defences you'll ever read about, and a great deal of British overconfidence, plus the reappearance of Holkar, Lake came to terms with the Jats rather than taking the city. Now, I first heard about this place as Burtpore in Alan Mallinson's novel The Sabre's Edge, which shows readers the second siege under Lord Combermore, who is probably better known as Sir Stapleton Cotton, one of Wellington's generals who had actually served in India during this war in a different theatre. And in that, Mallinson writes that throughout northern India, thereafter a taunting provocation arose amongst the population. Go take Burtpore, they said. Go do the impossible, because Lake had failed so spectacularly the first time. Fictionalized or not, I'm not sure. It rings true because everyone was stunned by this failure, as up to this point no one could remember the British failing to take a city whose walls had been breached. With that in mind, and addressing my subtitle, I want to draw your attention to the other theme of my book, which is to show the rise of what would later be termed the Indian Army. Now, when Napoleon was in St. Helena, Colonel Mark Wilkes, who was his sort of watchdog at the time, who had served during this campaign, was asked by the former emperor why the Indians just let the British stay in India. Were they just cowards? He asked. And the colonel said, they are by no means cowards. The best of them are as good as our European troops. Now, Napoleon's attitude to sepoy armies is essentially the attitude that remains today because of those Victorian authors that Andy brought up before. And it's just not the case, whether it's the Marathas or the British. The traditions and units that later formed the Indian Army that came to be in many cases began their journey during the Second Maratha War, when the presidency armies grew to an extensive scale and organization. The literature of this time period is replete with examples of British and European officers remarking on its prowess and efficiency. This perception that the British could not be beaten cannot really be sustained, but there could not even begin to be a myth without the presence of the presidency regiments of native infantry and cavalry, which in some here begins to take a truly formidable shape. And indeed it is from the years 1803 to 1806 that it begins to be called informally the Indian Army by its European officers, a distinct entity already. Those Europeans who served in the armed forces of the company even began to identify with themselves to the extent that those officers of the presidency armies would look with some dissatisfaction at the plaudits doled out to the king's regiments by senior officers, when more fairly they could point out that the sepoys had done a great deal of the work. Service with the company Bahadur was something one could build a reputation out of, even if the company did itself no favours by adhering to curious discriminatory rules that forbade men of mixed birth holding regular commissions, which sent many able soldiers into the Maratha service. And it's also interesting to see the seesaw of the military job market as the fall of the Marathas saw a large force of suddenly out of work sepoys available for company service, including the irregular formations like the legendary Skinner's Horse. So indeed, the East India Company Army came of age during this conflict on the plains of Deccan, amidst the guns at Laswari in Hindustan, and before the walls of Bharatpur, where after several failed attempts, the king's infantry refused to leave their trenches, and it fell to the 12th Regiment of Bengal Native Infantry to lead the next hopeless assault, and not only did so, but planted their colours briefly on the Sirli parapet of the unconquerable Jat fortress. The Second Maratha War, therefore, is many things. A pivotal moment in Indian history, a deep dive into the intricacies of warfare in India, a human and especially Maratha tragedy, and the bed in which the rather well-buried roots of a lineage of today's Republican armed forces have grown. It is much more than just that battle Wellington fought in India and in bullocks, grain and good Madeira. I hope I have been able to allow some of the participants to tell you their stories and why it's important. Thank you very much for listening and coming, and I hope you buy at least Andy's book. Over to you, Andrew.
Very modest of you there. I say I'm sure. I think both books are to be entirely recommended. I'm just going to do some magic and bring Andy back, and then hopefully we can go through some questions.
Hello, I'm back.
Hello. Right, I do keep posting. I've got half a dozen questions, but do keep posting them in the chat, and I'll try and go through those, and hopefully we kick some discussion off. I'm going to kick it off in person actually, because we had some debate on this one even before the session opened, with some comments on the Facebook post advertising it, and I described the part of the topic for tonight as the armies of the Maratha Confederacy. And I was gently corrected by a gentleman who said, no, it's the Maratha Empire. And I noticed you've used, I think both of you used the Confederacy tonight. I wondered, did you want to comment on that distinction, and what your thoughts on that might be?
Right. Well, the reason I've always viewed it as a confederacy, obviously before my researches commenced in any depth, it was always referred to as a confederacy by British authors. So yes, there might be a little bias there, simply because that's the term I'm used to. But having said that, if you actually look at the structure, if we can use that term, of the Maratha Empire, if you like, it assumes, an empire assumes a homogeneous force and a homogeneous rule, which simply didn't exist after the Battle of Panipat in 1761. You could get away with calling the territories, the various Maratha houses controlled under the Peshwa, an empire before 1761, but in the fragmentation that occurred after Panipat, it becomes a confederacy, because they're so often fighting each other. The period after the Battle of Panipat sees the rise of the House of Scindia under Madhaji, and its intense and almost continual rivalry with the House of Holkar. First Tukhaji Holkar and then Jaswant Rao. There's constant bickering between the sort of five great houses four great houses plus the Peshwa of the Maratha Confederacy. So I don't see how you can call that an empire. It is they're not even really states in the modern sense. It's a selection of bickering chieftains who combine, usually to fleece some other state, such as Hyderabad, when it suits them. When the Chauth, when it's time to get tribute from either the Rajputs or Hyderabad or anybody else who's daft enough to stand in their way. So I don't really see that empire is an accurate description.
Yeah, I would agree. And again, I'm sorry for the lack of video here. I've tried my best to troubleshoot it, but my tech skills are not up to the task. Yes, I agree. It can't really be called an empire, because it, like you say, it's a collection of semi-sovereign states that all, in times of danger, would sort of club together, or if they wanted to go and extort a chart from neighboring states, would band together. So it is very much more a confederation of Maratha houses than an empire. I believe the gentleman was probably referring to like the foundation of the Maratha state if you want to call it, at the very beginning under Shivaji, and his descendants who became I believe the Rajas of Satara, from whom the robes of the Peshwa were always handed down. But it's very, very difficult for my money to call it an empire.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up another question actually, which follows on rather neatly from that, which is to ask Philip's question. Were the Marathas, well, two questions. Were the Marathas a distinct ethnic, religious, and/or political entity? And was there any characteristic that made them a unique group to the rest of India?
I understand the Marathas as a distinct people, mostly due to language, the language they spoke. I believe that is how they were designated, and they were originally rather well thought of mercenaries for the Muslim states. I think is it of Golconda and things like that in the 17th century and things like that. Or is it Bijapur or something like that? I believe that's what my research. That's as much as I went into it, anyway.
Well, I have to say I didn't really go into it with that much, with a lot of depth. But yes, my understanding was that they considered, whether linguistically and politically, they considered themselves a distinct group. And obviously they're united under Shivaji, who, let's face it, he is the great Maratha hero. He won them he won them de facto independence from the Mughals by basically running Mughal armies ragged. And even if they weren't a distinct group before Shivaji, they certainly were afterwards. You know, that would be my view. Even though, and they don't use Persian as a script, because I did pick up one book on the Battle of Karbala, which is one of the battles featured in the book, and the front half was written in English, but the back half, where all the letters from the various Maratha generals were quoted, was all in Modi script, which I can't read even the slightest piece of. But it was still a damned useful book. So yes, they are a distinct group, and
certainly by our period, anyway.
Yes, definitely.
Okay, there was some.
Carry on.
Sorry.
I was going to say I think we should also just sort of say that in saying that, it's not necessarily that means that their armies and their sort of polity were distinctly 100% Maratha. Even Shivaji's armies were made up of pretty much everybody he could get his hands on who could fight.
Yeah. Again, as time wears on, their armies become less Maratha almost by the week.
Yes. I believe Ibrahim Khan's men were Muslims, I think.
Yeah, most of them were. Although he'd recruit anybody. He'd recruit anybody who had a horse and a sword. Obviously, most of the army of Hindustan sepoys, whatever religion they were not Marathas. That's made quite clear.
Absolutely.
That infantry service did not suit the Marathas of the late 18th century.
They were, and true Marathas, in quotes, preferred cavalry service, supposedly.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's the uncharitable amongst us might think it was so that they could get in amongst the loot first. You know? Certainly, if you were a volunteer or a Pindari. But then
I think Holkar would probably have agreed with that sentiment.
Yes, I mean Holkar's armies were largely. He did have infantry and guns, but they certainly were not of the quality of the army of Hindustan, especially after he chopped the heads off all his European officers who didn't fight.
Yes, absolutely. He saw what happened to the army of Hindustan and said, "I'm just going to head this off right here. You're all out."
Yes. Yes. Well, I mean, the shrewdest blow the British ever struck in the war was Lord Mornington's proclamation.
Absolutely.
Right, lads, you can all turn up and get your money.
Or you're all treasonous and going to be tried for it.
And yet there are still there's still anecdotal evidence that suggests that some Europeans
Yes.
definitely fought it say.
Definitely. They were heard in the smoke.
Yeah, shouting and saying, "Stick
him, yeah.
stick him, boys." Yeah. Whether there were any, I doubt if there were any Europeans. Well, we noticed at the Battle of Delhi, there were French commanders.
Yes, quite a lot of French.
There's Louis Bourquin, who
yes,
wasn't fit to command a corporal's guard, and the mysterious Major Geslin. We don't even know his first name.
Yeah,
and obviously, but a lot of the other officers had fled under the.
including the commander-in-chief in Hindustan.
Well, yes, I mean, as soon as the whole mess outside, outside Agra, it was just a joke. Perron just backed his horse and then legged it.
Absolutely,
there's no other way of putting it. He just legged it.
Yeah, he did.
But he got back to France with a tidy sum of cash.
Yes, he did.
Which was what the object of the exercise.
Yeah, exactly. Job done for him.
Okay, I suspect this could go off on various tangents and on that. There are more questions. I've got a couple of fairly specific technical ones, but one which I know was mentioned in the chat, but just to get the structure of the forces down, and perhaps Andy, if you could say something on the Army of Hindustan, and maybe Josh fill us in on the company army, but just in terms of brigades and battalions and regiments, the numbers. Established strengths and actual strengths.
Basic establishment of the Army of Hindustan is set up by Du Bois and still largely intact by 1803. Was each of the brigades at full strength had 10 battalions, of which 7 were Tilingas in red coats, 3 were Nujibs in the sort of Persian blue uniform. Each brigade was supposed to have at least one Rizala of cavalry, but the strength of the Rizalas did alter. The 2 contemporary accounts we have of those cavalry regiments says they were about 300 strong. Each infantry battalion had 5 guns attached to it. Now, in theory, these were 4 6-pounders and a howitzer. But Skinner makes it clear that the battalion he was with when he first joined as second in command of a Nujib battalion had 5 6-pounders. The organisation didn't tend to change. Other compus that were technically not part of the Army of Hindustan, although they served with it, such as the Begum Somrus, their battalions were averaged around 500 men, and again 3 to 5 guns was normal. The Begum Somrus brigade also had a 400-man cavalry regiment, but it doesn't seem to have been about much. As Smith puts it, the brigade was notable for the skill of its retreats. It was
yes. They were famous for being very adept at forming squares and marching off a battlefield, supposedly. Which,
but it did have one claim to fame, in my view. It was where George Thomas won his spurs. And I would love to tell Thomas's story in full, but this isn't the time or place.
No.
Because if there was ever a holy loony, he was the man.
Absolutely.
But that's the standard formation for most of the regular compus. I'm sure Josh can do the EIC battalions and the British battalions.
Well, yes, I certainly can. I mean, for what it's worth, the British side of things was administered in sort of 2 halves. You had on one side, you had one half what they call the King's forces, which is the British Army, sent out on loan to the East India Company, and they are organized by regiments of at this period, I believe it's mostly single battalions, but would later grow to 2 battalions each. And that is the extent of the sort of the organization essentially on a home footing. When they went abroad into the field, they would be taken by a commander-in-chief and made into brigades and sometimes divisions, depending on the size of the force. Most commonly brigades, which is 4 battalions. A battalion was in theory meant to be around 1,000 men strong, but was generally between 500 and 300 men strong, which is why talking about numbers in this sort of a discussion is kind of an arbitrary thing, because once they hit the actual field, they're usually under strength. Cavalry as well are organized by regiments and squadrons and troops. And as you were alluding to there, Andy, there's a lot of words used to describe the denominations of Indian cavalry, from risalas to goals and all sorts of things that don't really have any set number assigned to them. But again, a cavalry regiment was supposed to be between like 500 and 300 men strong. Then on the other side you have, and of course, accompanying artillery battalions and batteries. Then on the other hand, you have the presidency forces of the three presidencies of the East India Company, and they are supposedly, well, they're trying to ape the British model. So these are native infantry and cavalry regiments. Most of them are between 1 and a few battalions each, depending. It's a very transformative time for the East India Company Army. They are doing a lot of reforms. A lot of the reforms they do on Sunday will be changed by Wednesday, and it's a real headache. But rule of thumb, they were organized into administrative brigades, but it didn't really mean anything. And the commander-in-chief would arrange them as he saw fit into the brigades they would be in the field. And again, that's between 4 and 5 battalions, accompanying artillery, accompanying artillery and cavalry, usually in their own brigade separately. That's probably good enough. I hope that answers the question.
No, I think that's a really helpful overview. Could we drill down? We've got a few questions going into the detail of the Hindustan brigades. I mean, a fairly straightforward clarification just to kick things off. You mentioned that they were trained in the British manner. The question from Alan there was that in terms of the drill or the fire discipline that they use? What was?
As far as we know, as Louis Ferdinand Smith makes clear, he says that they were trained by the old British drill of 1780. Now, quite what he means by that has never been cleared up, but they still certainly used platoon fire, because De Boyne makes it clear that at the not Merta, the one before, but that he attacked the enemy earthworks and with artillery, and then as his troops approached, he says that they engaged them with platoon fire. So they certainly used platoon fire rather than the more modern British view that had sort of grown up in the post-American War of Independence of sort of getting as close as you can and then letting rip with one mighty volley, such as Lake's forces did at the Battle of Delhi. I would have as my opinion that the army of Hindustan was probably a little bit slower in its manoeuvring as a 7 Years' War army as a 7 Years' War army rather than a Napoleonic army. An army that hadn't had the American War of Independence experience, if you like. But that's only an opinion, and it's one that would be willing to be changed by the acquisition of new information.
That makes sense to my mind. I mean, what I turned up for my book was that the British in India tended to rely on file firing. and there's a couple of accounts that speak of some battalions in Lake's army engaging in firing, especially when it engaged against cavalry. And I think at least one chap said that one of the campoos at Assai gave them platoon fire as the cavalry charged. So, and the slowness of the army of Hindustan is probably fair as well, because witnesses at Assai said that they the famous changing of the Maratha front
Yes.
was done in a kind of a clumsy manner, but it was done. They thought.
That's Blackiston, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think so.
I'm just trying to find the particular battle of.
I'll throw out a follow-up question while you're looking there. I think it picks up on the same sort of themes.
Yeah, the Battle of Provan is the one, because there's an extant letter from De Boyne himself that describes the Battle of Provan.
Yeah, I think that there's a great deal of confusion about this sort of like really in-depth sort of choice of how you deliver your fire, because actually you can be very specific, and you can tailor how your troops fire to this specific instance.
Of course.
So it's again quite a difficult question to answer simply.
If I could come in with a follow-up then. So we've got Andrew here. He says, from reading, one gets the impression that the Indian infantry were perhaps the greatest cause of trouble to the British. Is this true? Could they be said to be superior to the British in terms of equipment, numbers, and handling? Well, numbers, I think you've demonstrated that certainly there were a sight more of them than any of the British generals could field. But equipment and handling, your thoughts on? I think handling we've already discussed.
Handling almost certainly not. Not by the time of the Second Maratha War, because in the weeks immediately preceding and at the beginning of the war, a lot of the battalions had lost their European officers.
Yep.
They were being what you actually got was competent battalions commanded by their subadars and jemadars, but nothing higher. There was no real command structure above battalion, simply because most of the European officers who were used to cooperating with one another had left, and the few that had remained, if you read the book, you'll find out what other European officers' opinion of Colonel Louis Bourquin was.
Yes.
Although his opinion of himself was wonderful.
Oh, yes.
And even Perron, although he could run a battle, wasn't.
He either was. I mean, he either was completely undermined by Bourquin, or and the chap who Scindia supposedly sent up to replace him.
No, I'm
or yeah, exactly. Or he was in Lake's pocket from the very beginning. Either way, and there is some evidence to suggest he was in Lake's pocket from the very beginning.
There is a little circumstantial evidence to suggest he was in Lake's pocket.
Yeah.
Sarkar puts later evidence to suggest that the Begum Somru had already decided to change sides, and that her troops were only looking for the chance to do so.
I think I remember that it could have been Wellesley that wrote that the Maratha sepoys were better equipped, or at least one of the brigades were better equipped than their own sepoys. So some British officers certainly thought that they were excellently equipped.
Well,
but
Sangster had been producing muskets, at their arsenal for some years. I mean, Sangster was a Scottish mercenary who became a better cannon founder and musket producer than he was a soldier. They had a serious arms industry.
Oh yeah, definitely. As far as was the
British
Indian
took over all the guns that were captured at Assay.
They were very impressed.
Straight into service, and they were
very impressed. Were the Indian infantry the greatest cause of trouble to the British? Difficult to say. The British were of the, like you say, because they had lost their cohesion, they were kind of rudderless. It's difficult to say how they would perform against the British at optimum level. But the British thought they were very dogged, that they held their ground very well, but they could be broken.
Yeah, they couldn't maneuver. I mean,
yeah,
that was their problem. They'd lost. I mean, there's Bourquien's account of the Battle of Delhi is fascinating because he tries to get his troops to maneuver, and they seem to have decided they didn't want to do it, or they'd forgotten it.
Yes, exactly. I think that's a clear sort of identification, sort of like clear evidence that there's a lot of officers are not there anymore, and therefore they can't move around the battlefield like Wellesley could get his men to maneuver at SI.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely But again, what's fascinating is how well those rudderless battalions still fought at Assay, at Delhi, at Leshwari. You know, I mean, Leshwari is a bloodbath.
That's
nobody's running away.
No, no, just standing there and getting killed, really.
Okay, there were several more questions on organisation and comparing the forces, which I think, to be honest, we've covered most of the ground in the discussion. So I'm just going to throw one last one out there because it wraps up the organisational side. It's one from Scott. He says the brigades or compus seem to be combined arms corps run as quasi-commercial concerns. Do you have any evidence of higher level organisation outside of campaigns, divisions potentially? He says the Sikhs were approaching this level until around 1840 when it all went pear-shaped.
Well, for the Army of Hindustan, yes, because at its strongest there were 5 brigades. Although 2 of those brigades were not formed under De Boyne. So the first 3 brigades were all formed under De Boyne, and they did work together when it was needed. Each of the brigades is not a brigade in the British Army sense. 10 battalions and a cavalry regiment with 50 to 60 guns.
That's a division.
It's a small division. You know, it's a division. It's
almost an army in some cases. The British armies have gone into the field with 10 battalions, and
this is true. The brigades. I mean, a brigade in addition, and I had failed to mention this, would have a siege train attached to it, because a lot of the work that the individual brigades did, even when there was no large war, was marching up to some recalcitrant Raja's fort and saying, "Listen, pal, you owe me a chunk of money.
Yep.
Are you going to pay up?" And when he said no, they blew his fort in and took everything they wanted.
There's also the matchlock men, Ali Ghouls, that are attached to every. Some said there was like 1,000 of them attached to every campu, who seemed to skirmish a little.
Well, there was certainly, in theory, in addition to the regulars, there was a Rohilla battalion, which would be the Ali Ghouls. That the irregular part of it does seem to have been more fluid. I was never able to pin down exactly what the irregulars that were attached at any one time had. It was anything from 500 to 1,000, and then of course there's the Mewatis, who were supposedly there for camp security.
And the Arabs who garrisoned forts and things, and
yeah, well, again, the Arabs seem to be much more of a feature in the post Army of Hindustan period.
True.
They were using Rajput mercenaries when they could get them for forts, or Rohillas. But for the sort of third Maratha War, there are thousands of Arabs about.
Yeah.
So they must have come in. This is not to say that they weren't there before, but
the
real numbers are a post. You know, they're a post Wellesley, if you like.
Yes.
Okay, if I can move on from organisation, a few slightly more random questions on different topics. I'll pose Garinder's next because he's badgering me in the chat to ask it. He says, Andy, does your book cover the Sikh dominion Sikh domination over Maratha territories? Only minor Sikh states paid any revenue to the Marathas, or major Sikh leaders received tribute from territories around Delhi up to Awadh. Cindy, could not do anything about this. Another caveat: Sikhs helped Lord Lake against the Marathas. So some comments on the Sikh involvement in all this, I think, from our Sikh expert in the audience.
Well, now I didn't find a great deal of evidence of Sikh involvement. There was to say there was none is wrong, because the Sikhs were pressing in on Delhi, but Thomas did his best to keep them in check. Sometimes it wasn't that good at best, but it's Thomas's career is a separate entity. It doesn't impinge that much on the army of Hindustan until they had to fight him. There's also notice of numbers of Sikh cavalry in mercenary service, scattered all over the place. Whether they paid tribute or not is another matter. I haven't been able to find. Certainly, they did. Thomas spent his time. What's the phrase he uses? Levying contributions, which usually meant galloping about along with his hard marching infantry, blowing in Sikh forts and taking everything that wasn't nailed down. He certainly had an official task in imperial service of watching the sort of so-called northwest frontier of Hindustan, and it was always his ambition to defeat the Sikh states on the Hindustan side of the Sutlej, because he didn't have the strength to cross the Sutlej. It never materialized. So yes, there was Sikh involvement, but how much of it in detail, I haven't actually researched in depth yet, because Thomas's story remains to be told.
Yeah, there's amongst the sort of record of the battles in the Second Maratha War, the British mention units of Sikh cavalry, especially in the Hindustan campaign, who threatened flanks a couple of times, and I believe there is fragmentary, again, references to sort of semi-independent Sikh formations riding around as Lake is moving towards Rajasthan and things like that. I think some of them, there were sort of parcels of Sikh mercenaries working in most, I think, of the Indian powers, and but it is true. Holkar made a run for Punjab after Bharatpur, and he tried to enlist Ranjit Singh assistance in fighting the British, but Holkar was just he never had any luck with forming alliances, unfortunately. And Ranjit Singh was nobody's fool. He's saying, you're losing, buddy. What are you trying to get me to do here? Because
he wasn't ready.
No, because Lake followed him, was hot on his heels, and he Skinner was there. Skinner writes very proudly of plunging into the, in quotes, Hidaspes, and there was a grand display of British cavalry and their brand new shiny horse artillery, which apparently Ranjit Singh just thought was the bee's knees. And the Sikhs were, Ranjit Singh, the most powerful of the, I guess, Maharajas at the time, because that was why Holkar just made a beeline for him. Wasn't having any of it, and that was the end.
Well, in one level, Ranjit was the only one left.
Yeah, it's true. And he remained so because he didn't get involved with Holkar.
Yeah, he had more sense.
Yep.
It doesn't. The Anglo-Sikh War is a different animal. It's not. It's even though if you want to be picky, you can track the similarities between Scindia's compus, and some of the Sikh compus.
True.
Right. Next,
if we can move from Sikhs to Americans, I mean, the specific question was, do we know which colony the Americans stand from? But perhaps a little more about our American mercenary in.
I'm going to leave this one completely to you, Andy, because I know there was an American, but I've forgotten who he is. And hello,
hello, of Massachusetts.
Hello, Chaz.
That's the only one. That's the only one with a definite. Apparently, he'd been an American soldier. No idea why he ended up in India, but he is noted as American. He had a brigade. He had a compu of approximately 3 battalions that probably fought at the Battle of Kardla for the Nizam of Hyderabad, and then apparently there was some kind of court intrigue which caused him to leave Hyderabadi service and go to the service of the Peshwa, where he was instrumental in a bit of the political shenanigans there and put down a couple of riots by Arab mercenaries. Other than that, I've not been able to find out anything else about him. He appears momentarily. He's one of those fleeting mercenaries.
There are lots of them like that.
No, thank you. Next one then. I only got a couple left. I'm sure you'll be pleased to know. We'll try and wrap things up for past. But something actually we were talking about just before we went live. The question from Arthur is, it says the native illustration as on the cover is wonderful. Is there a compilation somewhere? Well, I know, because we were talking about a lot of these can be found on the Anne S.K. Brown collection, which of course is online. But
yes.
So some comment on the visual sources for.
There's also a lot of assorted sources on the Facebook group, East India Company and Raj Study Group, that has a lot of images of varying sorts in it, from photographs of more modern times back to water reproductions of watercolors and stuff by native artists.
There's also the Fraser archive as well.
Yes, there is. There's also an Irish archive, which has a wonderful print of the Begum Somru's army, which shows them in blue uniforms with sort of red turbans and white cross belts, and the gunners are in green, but they're all dressed in Persian Indian style. You know, the long coats, rather. They're not dressed in European style. But I haven't yet found out whether that's public domain or not, and if it's not, then I might have to shell out later. But that's a lot of the illustrations in mine in Josh and in your book, I believe as well, Josh, came from the Anne S.K. Brown, which is a wonderful resource if you've got an hour to lose just trying to find the title of what you want. It's the organization of that is insane. You've got to know what you want before you try and search for it.
Yeah, pretty much.
It's because if you punch in just a generic term, as I did, I think I punched in Madras sepoys or something, and I got a huge list of nothing, most of which were from the 1890s. Or I punched in the Battle of Assaye for illustrations. There is nothing there called the Battle of Assaye.
Yes.
So it's just a case of. I would certainly recommend the Facebook East India Company group, because I found, although I didn't join until after I'd written the book, there is a lot of resource there for viewing, certainly viewing stuff like that, and they tend to name their sources so you can go to that specific source. There's some chaps on there who know what they're about.
Oh, thank you. That's a useful tip. I might need to hunt out for that one. We've got another couple of Indian books in various stages of development. So always looking for good images. I'm going to end with 2 more questions. I hope you'll be pleased to know, but both in terms of learning of lessons. One I think we've maybe covered to some extent, but just to wrap things up, if I've got anything else to say, from Beatrice, who asked, did the Marathas consciously try to learn from Western, British, French military insights, organisational principles in the way that the Ottoman Empire and the Egyptians did?
Shortly, no. Once the army of Hindustan was smashed, the Marathas did keep regular infantry and guns on their books, as it were. They did keep having regular brigades, but on a much lower scale. I mean, they kept them certainly until the so-called One-Day War, when the last European commander, who was the son or possibly grandson, I'd have to look it up to check, of one Philos, who was an Italian, one-time Italian mule driver. It was one of his grandsons retired from mercenary service just before the British the One-Day War, the Gwalior campaign began in 1843, and he was the last of the European mercenaries, really.
Although, and before that, of course, it sort of was a question of I don't know, fashion. At first, Benoit Dubois tried to implement British drills and brigade, sort of a European brigade structure. And I have a feeling that generally, if a Frenchman came to command it, things would start to look more French. And then if someone who came from the East India Company armies came in, then things would sort of swing back towards looking a bit more British. But so early on, in India, generally speaking, there was definitely a great move to try and modernize towards European regular brigades. Most states had them. Like you were saying, in Hyderabad, there was the famous French Corps.
Yeah, Raymond had, I mean, his brigade is the only one that's effectively a small army. I mean, he had 14,000 men.
Yes, exactly.
But a lot of the brigades, one of the things you find, especially earlier on, it tightens up later, but some of the brigades move from employer to employer.
Yeah.
Lestino seems to have served the Jats, he served as well as the Marathas. Some of the other René Madec's brigades seems to have served. I mean, he seems to have served several different masters as well. I suspect it was because only Madhaji had the financial wherewithal. Yeah. To say, right, I want now you've done the first one. I want you to make me another one, just the same.
Exactly. Yeah, like in after. Yeah, it wasn't quite as sort of dramatic as the way the Persians and the Ottomans did it, where they sort of came into contact with European forces and then immediately started to implement what they called the Nizam, various sort of incarnations of Nizam troops or new troops.
Yeah.
It was a much sort of more drawn out thing in India and depended on the state. But I think
the Ottoman state was much more centralized, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. As was the Persian one. So for the Marathas, it was a question of, yes, at first they did adopt European stuff, but afterwards they were kind of the army of Hindustan had been smashed, so they couldn't learn very much and rebuild without the British coming and hitting them on the head again, really.
And if I could pick up on the British then for the final question to wrap things up from now he asked to what extent did Wellington learn from his mistakes in India rather than any successors. But I mean, if you wanted to say a little bit about the lessons the British learned more generally, then please do to wrap things up.
Well, Wellington is very it's a very famous quote that supposedly later in his life someone asked him what was best thing you did by way of fighting, and he supposedly in a ghostly voice said "Asai" or something like that. The truth is that he counted it as one of his top 5 battles or something like that, and he changed his opinion on what his best battle was throughout his life. So it sort of depended what he was thinking about at the time. he said also later in his life, which I think is more pertinent, that he learned everything that there was to learn about soldiering by the time he left India. And you can see, certainly for Wellington's part, the India training in him when he's planning his campaigns, and certainly early on in Portugal, where he's very kind of audacious, as if he is in India and he's trying to attack things. And you see it a little in 1812 when he's beaten the French at Salamanca and he rushes on at Burgos. That's exactly what he would have done in India after destroying a field army. He would attack the fortresses and they would generally fall. He even said of Burgos, it was not unlike a hill fort in India, and I had got into a great many of those. So basically, he learned his soldiering there. He learned practically everything that carried him through the rest of his career in India, especially the lessons of logistics. Because if you don't know how to handle your logistics in India, your army will die. And that is it.
And of course, India was the place of what Wellington came nearest to a defeat, where he was dreadfully embarrassed outside Seringapatam by rocket men. There's a wonderful phrase where he, I think, if I remember the quote correctly, he squirmed with embarrassment.
Yes, there is one of there's something like that. The whole Sultan Petter Tope thing.
That's the one.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and again, he learned his lesson at SI in that he'd learned to be very careful how you approach a Maratha army. Like at Argam, it was textbook. He knew it was in front of him. He knew how to approach it. He had everybody ready. He even just sort of waited while some of his troops panicked because they thought it was going to be another assault. He brought them back into line and everything like that. So he learned his lessons about fighting in India, and then carried over the lessons he learned overall about generalship, I think, through the rest of his career. I think it can also be fairly said that many British officers who went to India, I mean, it was in a way a sort of a school for the British officer corps, even though later in the century you got great disdain if you were an India officer or something like that. But generally speaking, that was the only place you could get a good battle. Of a scale.
I would agree with that. In India, you either campaigned or died.
Yeah.
It's difficult. The disdain that British officers felt for Indian officers, as it were, even though they were both all British, was largely a huge social distinction because they weren't out. Remember, East India officers didn't purchase their commissions, old chap. Don't you know? And a lot of it was social rather than.
Those ragamuffins.
I get the impression that the king's officers who didn't know their business resented being told how to get on with it by chaps who actually did know their business.
Yeah, absolutely. There is that great story of how East India cadets are selected. I think it's is it Fraser or someone like that who just showed up at India House having got the interview, and I put it in the book. It's he shows up and they say, "Are you willing to die for your country?" And he says, "Yes." And they say, "Well, you're on the next boat."
Go in. Yes. But it was, campaigning in India was tough. I mean,
absolutely.
You make that perfect, probably clearer than any other book I've read on it. You make that perfectly clear, and it's about, you've got to be able to feed your troops and supply them, and
where there is no food anywhere, as well.
You've got to carry everything with you. You can't rely on the European model, and that's probably why Wellington got so testy over the failure of supplies in Spain.
Yeah, I think that is probably where his sort of OCD logistical kind of nitpicking comes from is really, I remember the days when we would all die of starvation, basically, if I didn't get these bullocks.
Well, it's hard to concentrate the mind, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, chaps. So on that timeless lesson, I think if we bring things to an end, thank you very much for your contribution. I can see lots of favourable comments and requests for more Indian material from the audience, which I'm more than happy to commission if you two want to write it.
I will be talking to you about that.
Yes, indeed. Well, I'm glad about that. There's some excellent ideas for possible topics in there, and as I say, there are a couple of Indian books with other authors already in the pipeline. So.
I have to put some thought into it. I ran across the story, the campaigns of Coote and Hyder Ali.
Oh yes,
yes, definitely the earlier stuff and the.
I've got an interest in the Buxar campaign as well. It's whether I can dig out enough contemporary sources, because it's
you know where I am, and by the sounds of it, we've got an audience in place. So
well, yeah, there's thoughts have got to be thunk, I think.
Yes, I think so.
Well, get them thunk, and we'll have those conversations. But thank you very much, gentlemen. I can see all the applause in the chat. I'm going to take us off stage in a moment. I'll leave the chat up for a couple of minutes more if people want to say their goodbyes, and I'll put up the discount code again. So all of those of you who said you're going to buy one or both of the books to complete your collections, you've got no excuse for not doing so. You'll be able to use the discount until midnight tomorrow night. But good night from all of us. The next one of these for February, we're hopefully going to have Abdon Haggis talking about his book on the redcoats in the American Revolutionary War. So I'll hopefully see some of you for that. But until then, good night, everybody, and thank you.
Thank you.